John Lynch stands as the provisional leader of Ireland. He had been navigating the shadows for years, trying to overthrow his rivals Thomas Costello and Richard McKenna. However, he would not hold this title for long. He addressed his government at the Capitol building, which had gone from a parliament to a palace to a provisional assembly within a year. He announced the annulment of both the Irish Republic and the short-lived kingdom, creating the Irish Commonwealth as him as chief protector. He fancied himself a Cromwell of sorts, overthrowing the king, although that king had been in power for less than a week. This decision was, to say the least, bizarre, considering Ireland's history with Cromwell, but with Prussia's hesitant support, he paved along. He was sworn in and immediately faced dozens of rebellions from members of the Republican army who had refused to disband when he had handed control to the Prussians. The Irish Home Legion and the Prussian Marines were able to mostly put the revolts down, but guerrilla forces roamed throughout the countryside and full armies remained in the remote areas of the country. One such army rampaged Connacht, and the only nearby force was Callahan's army in Belfast, which had stayed neutral through every regime change. He ordered the colonel to destroy the rebels, and Callahan promptly responded with "fuck off with your politics." Lynch yelled at his advisors at the audacity of the letter, but once his tantrum ended, he went back to losing grip of his country. As for Callahan, he was beginning to get tired of all the nonsense. He had seen 3 regime changes in the last year, and the Prussians just went along with it so long as whichever leader came next sold out Ireland as well. He didn't intervene as he had his hands filled enough dealing with the Protestants, and he began to think an intervention may be necessary. He slowly took control of the civilian administration of Ulster and geared up for a potential conflict. But until then, the North remained stable and ready under the colonel's command. As for the rest of the country, the Republicans gradually coalesced into one unified force. Sensing an opportunity, Thomas Costello returned to the country 4 months after he was first exiled and led the revolt from Kerry. Lynch sent urgent cries to the Prussians to redouble aid, but the king was at the end of his wits with Lynch. Not only had he been visiting foreign emissaries in secret meetings, he had been undermining the Prussians' position in various ports throughout the nation, while simultaneously requesting aid whenever his policies began failing. As a result, the embassy locked its doors and demanded that Lynch go to Wexford for any discussions. The king transferred authority to supervise Ireland's interior from the navy to the national corps, and slowly the king made preparations for what he felt was going to be an imminent occupation. Callahan Schuster chose Éamon Mulcahy, one of his most competent field commanders, to lead the newly established Irish National Corps. They would act as both a police force and special combat force capable of both conventional and guerrilla combat. 500 National Corps soldiers arrived at the Prussian embassy in Dublin, and the ambassador was replaced with the Prussian Commandant Richard Schuster. They would handle absolute emergencies in the capital, and report directly to Mulcahy in Wexford. Lynch was incensed, and demanded that the Prussians remove soldiers from the otherwise empty embassy. The Prussians gave no response. Over the course of multiple months, the Republican forces rapidly took the southwest of the country, and are at the doorstep of Cork. Lynch ordered hundreds of Home Legion soldiers to defend the city, but due to poor logistics and miscommunication, most were left without weapons or even food. Costello led his forces into battle like in the days of old as the Home Legion surrendered en masse. He began his celebrations only to notice hundreds of soldiers in a blackish-green uniform on the horizon. It was nothing like the bright green of the Home Legion uniforms, but he couldn't quite make out what it was. They stood silent until they sent a delegation. The man informed Costello that while they would not intervene, the Irish National Corps would secure everything east of Cork. Costello reluctantly nodded along. Lynch stood in Dublin, walking in circles, audibly murmuring about how the rebels would win. His advisors stood silently by, as any attempt to console him would result in a long and annoying outburst as Lynch whined about the unjustness of the situation. In all truth, the war was winnable, but he stood in fear, paralyzed for days, allowing the rebels to make large gains with no response. Lynch was in a particularly bad mood following the fall of Cork, and in the previous days he had sent urgent messages to the Prussians in Wexford demanding aid. As he was doing this, a message arrived, and he opened it up happily, expecting it to be from the Prussians. However, it was from Edward Callahan, informing him that the National Party had won all local offices in Ulster, as well as all seats in the Belfast Assembly. At this point, Lynch slipped from stupidity into psychosis. He went around asking all of his advisors what they knew about this assembly, what they knew about the National Party, and why they were betraying him. Lynch went up to his Secretary of Finance and then began interrogating him as if the secretary was Callahan himself. His advisors stood in fear as they wondered if Lynch had gone genuinely insane. However, it was just another one of his rants, and after a few hours he calmed down and proceeded to do nothing about the war. Callahan had sent the letter as more of a probe than anything else, and with absolutely no government response, he began to get things moving. His newly established National Party began running the region independently from the central government. Citing the national emergency, Edward Callahan declared himself commander-in-chief of the north of the nation, taking both civil and military command. But for now, however, he didn't move to the south, and instead essentially made public what was de facto the situation for nearly half a year already. This, however, was the final tipping point for Lynch. In the middle of the night, he announced to his advisors that the war was over, and that they must destroy Dublin before it can get into the rebel hands. They looked stunned, but before they could respond, Lynch left with a contingent of home guard. He ordered them to set fire to the city, but they simply stood still. Lynch screamed at how they're all traitors for clumsily setting fire to a house. The soldiers began descending on him until he fled to the outskirts, disguised himself as a priest, then fled the city. Nobody knows what exactly happened to him. Some say he was found and executed, others say he traveled across the Orkney region, and others say he simply fled into exile. Regardless, when the sun rose, all that was accomplished was the burning of 3 houses and a school as the Republican army descended upon Dublin. Costello arrived in the city where he was immediately met with Eamon Mulcahy. He congratulated Costello on his victory and informed him of his promotion to Governor of Ireland. Costello would handle internal affairs aside from the economy and would get to live in Dublin with a handsome salary. Mulcahy patted his shoulder and walked out of the room as Costello stood with an unbridled rage. Mulcahy immediately began reorganizing the nation, deploying National Corps soldiers across the country and beginning a campaign of pacification in the countryside. There would be no more pretenses. The Prussians were in control of Ireland. Costello was furious at having just won a war only to be made impotent, but he was powerless to respond, so instead stood fuming as everything he fought for, including his own personal pride, turned into ash. Edward Callahan stood at the Belfast headquarters with a group of army officers and officials from the National Party. It had been 3 weeks since the governorship was installed, and all in the north were waiting Callahan's response. He stood in front of the small group and began to address them. Quote, "Many of you have said that it is time to act. The time for waiting is over. I too have grown to believe this. While those fools in the capital go back and forth killing themselves, we have kept this land as a bastion against the foes from outside and from within, unscathed from all the wars and conflicts which have been so cruelly imposed on our people by the vile Prussians. So then I say, it is time to act. It is time to march. No more of this nonsense. Ireland shall be free." Those words shook the nation. It seemed as if Ireland was at the crossroads between one last chance of liberation or eternal oppression. Callahan stared over the Emerald Isle and became ready to march. As the last sentence of that speech was spread through the land, it became a rallying cry to all. A few days later, Costello arrived at Belfast asking for Callahan to back him. Callahan saw utility in the old president and ordered him to publicly back his mutiny and call all of his forces to join. Dublin, however, was left in chaos. Costello had left in the middle of the night without telling a soul. His advisors were left in the capital alone as they realized what had happened. Riots spread throughout the city as officials and home legionnaires fled either north to Belfast or south to Wexford. The battle lines were finally being drawn. Only a skeleton crew of the Presidential Guard remained in Dublin, protecting the capital and shooting anybody who got too close. Richo Schuster realized the opportunity, but also realized that holding Dublin would be untenable. So, he got his soldiers to the embassy and raided the bank, carrying every gold bar they could find and marching back to Wexford to meet up with Mulcahy. The Irish Home Legion had collapsed, with nearly 70% of the soldiers defecting to Callahan, who had just proclaimed himself Commander-in-Chief of the Free Irish State. The soldiers remaining loyal to Prussia were folded into the Irish National Corps, and Mulcahy ordered all of his soldiers to occupy the south of the country as the race to Dublin began. Callahan used the influx of volunteers brought by Costello's announcement to make a force large enough to defend against the Prussians once they reached Dublin. After this, he court-martialed Costello and had him removed from the government for losing Dublin in the first place. With this, Callahan sent every force at his disposal to march towards Dublin, and Mulcahy did the same with his National Corps. Ireland, for a brief moment, became the focus of the whole world, as the question of Prussian hegemony in the region would be settled here and now. At the turn of the century, December 26, 1799, Edward Callahan's army marched into Dublin, the hours before Mulcahy's forces would arrive. With it, the National Corps were temporarily repelled, and Dublin was theirs. Peace wouldn't be so simple. Mulcahy immediately began fortifying the entire south, and made it clear that any advance would mean a long and grueling war from which Callahan would never recover. The king, however, was not so keen on a long protracted war, which would drain Prussia for the sole purpose of spiting the Irish. He ordered Hardenberg to Dublin to sign a peace treaty, with the only condition being that Wexford must remain Prussian. Callahan was hesitant, with not only the National Corps occupying the south, but also having the entire Irish gold reserve. Eventually he agreed, with the condition that the Prussians have no artillery facing Ireland and that all who joined the National Corps would be sent out of the country and into Wexford. The treaty was controversial among some of the Republicans, and it seemed as if a potential coup was possible. However, the chief rallied both public and army support and made illegal any opposition to the National Party. 2 days after the peace, Callahan addressed how Ireland would be run. He proclaimed that before democracy could be implemented to Ireland, a period of dictatorship would be necessary to stop Ireland from falling once again to foreign rule or internal unrest. The National Party would rule under the Commander-in-Chief's control to guide Ireland back to stability. It was certainly controversial, but with the army occupying the island and with decades of fighting behind them, most were just happy to see an end to the bloodshed. Callahan stood in the old capital and reorganized the nation based upon his vision. There would be no more coups, no more violence, no more nonsense. Gradually, a cult of national devotion was formed, and Callahan became the first European ruler under the nationalist despotic tradition which had risen in Icaria and would later spread across the world as the counterweight to the monarchies of old. Unlike most, however, Callahan did have democratic interests ultimately in mind, no matter how heavy-handedly he ruled for the time being. Regardless of whether Callahan was right or wrong, it seemed as Ireland, in some sense of the word, was free. Things, however, did gradually improve. The colonel ruled less with an iron fist and more with a steady hand, though still not permitting any challenges to his National Party. Eventually, a new bureaucracy began to form around the National Party, forming a sort of breakwater against more military coups or uprisings. Protests began to ring out in 1805, but Callahan used the British Revolution and the rise of Thomas Bradford as a justification to maintain his rule. Despite the dictatorship, Callahan did make true his promises of never falling back to foreign rule. Though he mingled with the Icrians of the O'Donnell crisis, he kept his distance and kept Ireland neutral even as the world was becoming more and more at arms. The economy began to slowly and steadily recover, and it seemed like for the first time, an Ireland at the very least built around the people was arising. Eventually in 1808, the Irish Constitution was a step towards eventual democratization. The Irish Republic was restored and a parliament was adopted, though only the National Party were allowed to run, and Callahan was the only presidential candidate. Still, he chose Carl O'Connor as his running mate, and publicly announced his intention to eventually retire. He ruled as president for 7 more years until he eventually announced the Constitution Decree and his retirement. He stepped down as president and commander-in-chief of the nation, and allowed elections to be held to choose the next president. His colloquial name of the Colonel was codified into law, with the semi-ceremonial position of Taoiseach, the Irish head of state which could be called by the government to exercise emergency powers if necessary. Other political parties were also allowed, though their influence was extraordinarily limited. The elections were held the following month, with O'Connor receiving 90% of the vote. Parliamentary elections were held the next week, and a similar result was had. It would be inaccurate to call Ireland anything but a one-party state led by the National Party, but at the very least, there is hope. Ireland marched slowly and steadily towards progress, and while many struggles undoubtedly await them, it will at the very least be within their agency to face them themselves. Hopefully that future will be bright, the tremendous sacrifices of the past paid off by the new dawn arising. I suppose we can only hope.